Today, we're going to look over these three big ideas, the ideas of natural rights, the ideas of popular sovereignty, and the idea of rule of law, and how our country was founded on those and able to really build them into our Declaration, our Bill of Rights, our Constitution, and how we understand these concepts today. So to do that, we are here with the Constitution Center's top scholar, Jeff Rosen. Jeff, you want to say hi to everybody? The chat is excited today.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited too, and I can't wait to dive right in. I think that we should begin with the Declaration of Independence and with natural rights, because the whole theory of American government is contained within the second sentence of the Declaration, and the paragraph that we're going to parse contains the idea of natural rights, popular sovereignty, and the rule of law all in one beautiful phrase. Now, I don't know that we need to even call it up unless Kerry can find it quickly on the screen, because we can all recite it by heart. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'm doing this from memory, so forgive me if I'm messing up slightly, but let me finish it. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever government becomes destructive of these rights, it is the right and duty of the people to alter and abolish it. Okay, so that's the idea that we have to parse today. In a half hour, we need to understand the philosophical underpinnings of the American idea. Where did Thomas Jefferson get those words? He stressed that he was not making them up. He wasn't original. He wasn't an innovator. He said he was merely channeling and synthesizing ideas that were common and in the air, taken from writers such as John Locke, Francis Bacon, Sidney, and Cicero, and Aristotle. Friends, we had the most amazing panel on Thursday, I think it was, on what the founders learned from the Greeks and Romans. Check it out on YouTube or on the Interactive Constitution if you have time, and we'll podcast it tomorrow. It was thrilling to hear three great scholars talk about what the framers took from the Greeks and Romans and how they channeled it through the Enlightenment thinkers to end up in the Constitution. So what I think I want to do is begin with natural rights and talk about what Jefferson understood there, and then we'll move out to popular sovereignty and then the rule of law. Kerry, how does that sound?
I love that, because I think it really helps build understanding. First, you have to talk about yourself, individual, and rights to be able to understand the power that you have through popular sovereignty, and then following the rule of law.
Wonderful. Love all the hellos and good mornings, and I'm as excited for this class as you are. You know what I'd like to begin with? Not the Declaration, but not Thomas Jefferson's Declaration, but George Mason's Declaration of Rights, because Jefferson had Mason's Declaration at his side when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, and James Madison had it at his side when he wrote the Bill of Rights. Can I screen share it, Kerry? Will you?
Yes, I was going to say, let's get you screen share. Make sure we.
Okay. Here we go.
Good.
All right. So first, we're going to look at Section 1, because it sounds a lot like the Declaration of Independence, that all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights, of which when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely, the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. This is so significant because it's a longer version of the first bit of the Declaration. And the big idea is right up top. We are born in a state of nature before we form governments. It's a kind of philosophical thought experiment that Enlightenment thinkers, most famously John Locke in his second treatise, imagined. And in this state of nature, we're born equally free and independent. We all have equal rights and equal liberties. That's important because it both gives us the idea of equal liberty and also the idea of popular sovereignty, because if we're all equally free, when we move from the state of nature to civil society to create a government, we can surrender or alienate or divest ourselves of certain rights in order to obtain greater security and safety of the rights that we've retained. This is called social compact theory, and it's a bargain. I am endowed by my creator, that is God or nature, with certain inherent or natural rights. Of these rights, some are alienable and some are unalienable. An alienable right is a right that I can surrender temporary control over to government in order to get greater security and safety of the rights that I've retained. What would be a quintessential example of an alienable natural right? Well, the power to punish violence, for example. If we're in a state of nature and everyone is just engaging their own self-defense and revenge, then we're not going to be very secure. But if I surrender or alienate the government to the exclusive power to punish crimes, then I have greater security and safety. I've received an equivalent in exchange for the right that I've temporarily alienated. But the whole bargain is contingent on the government keeping its end of the bargain. And if the government doesn't make me more secure and it doesn't protect the unalienable rights that I haven't surrendered, then I not only have the right but a duty to alter and abolish government so that I can protect this free and equal natural liberty that is unalienable. So that leads to the question of what's an unalienable right. The quintessential unalienable right, and we can go down a bit to get a sense of it, is the rights of conscience. Can you see section 16? Look at this. It's really cool how it's all in the Virginia Declaration. That religion or the duty which we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. Therefore, all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience, and that it is the mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity toward each other. Okay, there's a lot packed into this clause, but for George Mason and Jefferson and Madison and a bunch of the framers, the rights of conscience were the quintessential unalienable right. Why are my rights of conscience unalienable? Because they're based in my powers of reason. And this is the Enlightenment, and it's impossible to overstate how deeply all the framers believe in reason. They believe that our religious beliefs or lack of beliefs are the product of our reason, and all of us have the right and the duty to make up our own minds about whether or not to worship, whether or not to recognize the nature of the deity, and what we understand to be the truth about the nature or not of the deity. So they believed, John Locke writes about this not only in the second treatise, but in his Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which is his moral treatise. And here Locke is an empiricist who believes that we can only believe what we sense based on our external sensations or our reason. So unless we personally experience the divinity or an understanding of the nature of the divine, then we can't accept it for ourselves. That's why we have a duty to decide for ourselves. So my beliefs are the product of external sensations or experiences operating on my reason. They're essentially involuntary. I can't surrender to Kerry the power to control my thoughts because I can't control them myself. They're the product of external sensations and reading and my reason. And my reason is unalienable because reason is the core of who I am as a human being. That's how much they believe in reason. So and remember, this is not revelation. They're not saying accept it on faith, accept it because the Bible says it, accept it because Aristotle says it. They're saying we all have a duty to examine it for ourselves. So that's why the rights of conscience are unalienable. I can't surrender to Curry the power to control my thoughts or beliefs or lack of beliefs because I can't entirely control them myself. They're the power of external experiences operating on my reason. So now we have a great distinction between the alienable rights, like temporary control over the right to punish private violence, and unalienable rights, like the rights of conscience. Now, there's a section right up above here that's really interesting, section 15, that no free government or the blessings of liberty can be preserved to any people but by a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue, and by frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. This is thrilling. This is like a secret code about what Mason and Jefferson and the other framers understood by the pursuit of happiness. As we discussed in this great panel last week about the framers and the Greeks and the Romans, when Jefferson talked about the pursuit of happiness, he had in mind being good, not feeling good. Virtue is the key to happiness, said Jefferson, and it's the purpose of government to preserve the people's ability to pursue happiness through virtue. So nowadays we think of happiness as just, doing whatever feels good in the moment, having the extra ice cream. Aristotle and the classical authorities had something very different in mind. And here's the basic idea. All of us have certain unruly passions. Passions was basically the classical word for emotion. Our emotions are passions. Some emotions are good, like the ones that are listed here: justice, moderation, temperance, frugality. Those are all moderated passions. They're an example of using our powers of reasons to tame our selfish or unreasonable passions. So there's a distinction, and this becomes more explicit in the Enlightenment literature, the Scottish thinkers like Francis Hutcheson, or Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, where it's really explicit and totally exciting. We have a duty to use our powers of reasons to temper our selfish or antisocial passions like anger, jealousy, and fear, so that we can moderate our passions and achieve the virtues like justice, temperance, and frugality. If you go to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, you'll see that Aristotle sees every virtue, and the ones listed here are the classical virtues, which is why it's so incredibly exciting, isn't it, to see these Aristotelian virtues in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Justice, moderation, temperance, and frugality are the classical virtues. Each of those, says Aristotle, have an extreme that's either an excess or a deficiency. So I can't do this from memory, but you'll find them in the Nicomachean Ethics. The extreme of frugality would be, being miserly, and the deficiency would be extravagance. So you have to be not too much, not too little, just right in the middle. It's a kind of Goldilocks theory. But the big idea is use your powers of reasons to tame your unreasonable passions. And you'll see again and again in a moment when we start talking about the Federalist Papers, you'll see Madison saying that governments have to be organized to allow citizens to be ruled by reason rather than their unreasonable passions, so that government can achieve these virtues of justice, moderation, temperance, and frugality. Here's what's so exciting, friends. It's a double duty. On the one hand, our elected representatives have a responsibility to be virtuous. And the Constitution is set up through checks and balances and separation of powers to allow our leaders to behave with moderation. But at the same time, we as individuals in our private lives have an obligation to be virtuous and to use our powers of reasons to temper anger, jealousy, and fear. The central moral obligation of the classical and Enlightenment authorities that each of us has is basically to curb our enthusiasm, temper our emotions, achieve self-government, not just politically, but personally, in the sense of self-mastery, self-control, not giving in to all of those unreasonable emotions that can lead to us to hurt others, and also can lead us to lose precious time for productive work, so that we can cultivate these benevolent passions like justice, moderation, temperance, and frugality. All right, that was a whole lot. I know I got all excited.
It was awesome. And this is probably why, now I was remembering why I like this class so much.
Absolutely.
Because we get so two great questions from the chat, or one question, one comment. Michelle said something like, well, are these virtues in the United States Constitution? Are they not directly in there? Are they directly in there? Can I reference the fact that in some ways they're not in the Bill of Rights? So one question about virtues in the Constitution. Second question was around Chloe and Colin talking about, is it interesting that Jefferson kept talking about all these great virtues, but then enslaved people, and maybe I'm just going to call him a little bit of a hypocrite, like maybe not so virtuous? So there's your two big questions on this idea of natural rights and this belief around the virtues as well.
Crucial questions. Are the virtues in the U.S. Constitution? No, they're not. No, they're not, because Madison says in the Federalist Papers, if all men were angels, if all men were angels, no government would be necessary. If people have no virtue, then government isn't possible. By the time the Constitution comes to be drafted, our author, Thomas Ricks, of this great book, which is sitting across the room from me, First Principles, What the Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans, Ricks argues that by the time of the Constitution, the framers lost faith that you could create the whole government based on virtue, and wanted to create auxiliary precautions like separation of powers, checks and balances, to ensure that even if the people and our leaders were not virtuous, ambition would be made to counteract ambition, and ultimately mobs or hasty factions defined as a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason. That's the very definition of a faction. They basically couldn't organize well enough to do serious damage because they'd have to jump through too many hoops before they could wreak their passions into law. So they're not in the US Constitution, but they're the backdrop, they're the philosophical backdrop of the Constitution. And it is important. I mean, it's not just Jefferson, it is George Mason, it is James Wilson, it's Benjamin Franklin, it's John Adams. All of them say over and George Washington, over and over again, without virtue in the people, the whole system collapses. And the whole point of the system is to allow us, we the people, to pursue virtue and therefore happiness by exercising our equal liberty to achieve self-mastery. So it's definitely not a legal command. The government can't punish you for not being self-controlled or for being angry or losing your temper. And it's not, the system doesn't assume that everyone's going to be virtuous, but if no one is, they think the whole system just won't work. So it's certainly worth asking ourselves, in this age of Twitter and Facebook and hating on people and anger and the fact that we express our virtue through virtue signaling by tearing down the other guy, the blue people tear down the red people and vice versa. This is not the way the framers thought the system was supposed to work. And the question of how we achieve virtue, I mean, the only thing we can say is the framers thought each of us, you and me, have a big responsibility ourselves to master these passions. At least we can begin by tending to ourselves, and then so that we can hope the system will work. Now the question of Colin and other friends about, what about Jefferson's talking about virtue and happiness, but what about his views about slavery, is a very serious one. And Jefferson is a very complicated character. When you see his writings on virtue, it's not only enslaved people, where he was a complete hypocrite, although he did recognize his hypocrisy and said, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. He understood that slavery was inconsistent with natural law theory in some circumstances, but he was I use this phrase mindfully. He can only be called a racist because, and I'm going to give you an example of this. So the first African-American poet published in the United States was a brilliant woman called Phillis Wheatley, and she was an enslaved woman. She was 15 years old when she began to write poetry. She was freed by her masters in Boston. They educated her along with their own kids with a classical education. She read Aristotle and Cicero, and she began writing these amazing poems about virtue starting around the age of 15. You can read them, and they're brilliant. Now, her poems were so good that the city of Boston held a trial about whether or not she could have written them. Some racist people thought it's impossible that such brilliant poems could be written by an African-American person. Let's have a trial to find out. Do you know who presided over the trial? John Hancock, the guy who first signed the Declaration of Independence. And after this trial about whether Phillis Wheatley could have written her own poems, the committee graciously decides, yes, in fact, she did write her own poems and she should be recognized as the author of these brilliant poems. That's too much for Thomas Jefferson, who is so poisoned by his own racism that in section 14 of the Notes on Virginia, he writes a long screed to to his French correspondent, basically saying, well, maybe Phyllis Wheatley wrote her own poems, but they can't be considered excellent poems because no African American could write great poetry. And in this sense, and then he goes on to say, there was slavery in the times of the Greeks and Romans, but those slaves like Lucretius, who was an Epicurean philosopher, and Jefferson considered himself an Epicurean. So this is a problem for him. Here's an enslaved person in Greece and Rome who's a great apostle of the philosophy that he embraces. He says, yes, but Greek and Roman slaves were white, and therefore they were able to write great philosophy, and her poems are no good. That's how racist he was. He also goes on to say, Jefferson does, he's writing about ethics and morality, and he says the Greeks, the Stoics and Epicureans were good in emphasizing self-mastery. Then the Jews came along, but their morality was too crude and brutish, and it took Jesus to perfect the morality of the Old Testament, which was inadequate because the Jews didn't adequately emphasize love or benevolence. Now, in addition to being a crude reading of the Old Testament, which after all has the injunction, love thy neighbor as thyself, which Jesus said along with the other injunction that there's one God and love thy God with all thy heart, soul, and mind, or the essence of the teaching of the Old and New Testament. In addition to being an ungenerous reading of the Old Testament, it also was a sign of Jefferson's anti-Semitism as well. And then Jefferson goes on, as we talked about in the class on Thursday, to write the Jefferson Bible, where he basically cuts out the entire Old Testament, and he doesn't believe in the divinity of Christ or in the miracles, and just includes the ethical teachings of Jesus as the core of what he thinks the Bible is. So I mention all this to reaffirm the point of those of you who say that it's quite possible for the framers to have talked about the need to temper your unreasonable passions, and certainly hatred or racism is one of the unreasonable passions, to show that the framers fell short of their ideals. Sometimes they embraced these ideals that they fell short of in practice. Jefferson even knew it. I mean, he was embarrassed to some degree about it, but that doesn't excuse the incredible hypocrisy. Now, friends, I just have recently become attuned to this reason-passion distinction. I've been reading the diaries of John Quincy Adams. And as it happens, John Quincy Adams thought more explicitly about this reason, passion, virtue stuff than almost any of the other framers, because he was the son of John and Abigail Adams. Both of them are totally enmeshed in this classical tradition. We learned on Thursday from Carolyn Winterer, the brilliant Stanford historian who's written about women who were classically educated, that Abigail Adams was a fearsome mom who called herself Portia after the Roman examples. That was the way she signed herself in her love letters to John. And she's always exhorting John Quincy, master your unreasonable passions, work harder, don't marry this girl, Mary, because she's too, you're not, can't take care of her yet. I mean, she was a real helicopter mom, and he's chafing at it all the time. Meanwhile, John Adams is saying to John Quincy and the other kids, imagine yourself living in a French boudoir with mirrors on the ceiling and all the walls, and imagine that you're being observed at every moment, so that every time you have a passionate or angry or unreasonable thought, you've got to suppress it, or else it'll be reflected back to you. Talk about pressure. And Quincy Adams is almost overwhelmed by it, because he feels like can't live up to these high expectations. But nevertheless, he embraces it. He's constantly writing to his wife, Louisa, and his kids about the need to use your powers of reason to master the unreasonable passions so you can achieve temperance, moderation, fortitude, all those virtues that are in the Virginia Declaration. And he writes letters to his son, George Washington Adams. Talk about pressure. He names his son George Washington Adams, about the Bible, letters to his son about the Bible. And they're great letters that kind of distill Quincy Adams's understanding of what he called reasonable Christianity, which was very much in the era of the Enlightenment sources that the framers used. And there's a sad coda to that story too, I learned this weekend from the Adams diaries. He invests all of his hopes in his son, George Washington. He's exhorting him to be good and master his passions. And then the pressure is so much that George Washington Adams is on a steamship going to New York. He's just been unlucky in love and in business, and he jumps overboard and kills himself. and commit suicide. And John Quincy Adams and his wife Louisa have to console themselves by, by this philosophy and by their faith and by mastering their own grief and sorrow to have some recognition of the universal divinity, that they had faith connects all people. But it was just a tragic reminder that this constant injunction to be virtuous can be just too much pressure for people, and was hugely a lot of pressure on Quincy and his kids. All right, I mentioned all that because I think you can tell I'm really excited about it. I'm learning about it, but it's very relevant to our understanding. We talked about two big concepts already by talking about this notion of virtue, happiness, and natural rights. The first big one is we're all endowed by God or nature with certain rights, some of which we can surrender or alienate, others of which we can't. The second is that we're all equally free and independent when we're born. So when we make this contract, we're sovereign. We, the people, have equal rights and equal powers, and therefore no one person in creating the government can have any more power than anyone else. We, the people, as a whole, are sovereign. And the third idea is that the government is making a contract with us. And if it doesn't keep its end of the bargain by protecting the retained rights, we have a right and a duty to alter and abolish it. So the right of revolution is itself an unalienable right. It's almost like a security that we retain in case government doesn't keep its end of the bargain. And that's why the right of revolution, asserted in the Declaration of Independence, is itself an unalienable right. All right, Kerry, what do you make of all that?
I mean, I think it's amazing. I think it's amazing to think of your brain as something that you have a natural right that no government shall be able to manipulate the way you think, the way you believe, all those things. And that yet, in the same time, that you're given rights by the understanding of popular sovereignty to have power and control over that government because they're sovereign to you. And this all wraps together when looking at this idea of rule of law, that you may give away some rights, but you're giving them away understanding that the law is there to be equally applied and to be transparent and clear. So we have like 3 minutes to wrap up really quickly, but I really want to understand how do these three things work together in pulling in rule of law? And then is it always kind of a tricky balance between the three as we go through? And then I'm never going to forget the idea that I always will have the ability to rebel. That is something I think we should teach all kids. That is a part of your natural rights. You always have the right to rebel. It's your freedom of conscience.
Not just the right, but the duty. You have a responsibility to rebel if you believe that government is not.
Hear that, students?
And you also have a responsibility to exercise your rights of conscience. That's something I really want to exhort on you. This vision of freedom is not for the passive. You can't just accept what I tell you about any of this stuff. Hopefully I'm exciting you enough because I'm excited about it, and Kerry is, to learn more yourself. But you might come to completely different conclusions about the way the framers balanced rights and duties, or how they understood the rights of conscience, or how they understood virtue. But you must make up your own minds. That's the very essence of being a free individual with this natural right of conscience. All right, how does it all relate together? Well, we've talked a lot about the Declaration, but what about the Constitution? After all, that's what we're here to talk about. Well, so much of these ideas is contained in the first three words of the Constitution: we the people of the United States of America. That says it all, that it's we the people who create the government and retain the ultimate sovereignty. Now, the first three words don't solve the big question that divided the convention. Which people? We the people of the individual states, or we the people of the United States? If we go, I don't have time to screen share again, but if you go to the American Treasures part of the interactive Constitution, or click on the drafting table for the structural Constitution, you'll see that the very first words that James Wilson, who wrote the very first draft of the Constitution, which is at the Constitution Center and is also online, so you can't go to the Constitution Center now, check it out online. His first words were: resolved that the government of the United States ought to consist of a legislative, executive, judicial branch. The idea of three branches of government, separation of powers, was Wilson's first idea, and that's because no one branch is allowed to speak for we the people. we parcel out our power among the three branches and between the federal government and the states to ensure that we, the people, maintain the ultimate power. But which people? Wilson believed that we, the people of the United States as a whole, are sovereign. That's why his second draft said, we, the people of the states of New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantation, and so forth, to ordain and establish this Constitution. But the final draft, which was adopted just a week before the Constitution was actually signed on September 17th, says, we, the people of the United States. Some say they took out the states because they didn't know who would sign, but others, and I like to think that these others are right, like Akil Amar, my great teacher, says that the language was changed to signal Wilson and Gouverneur Morris's belief that we, the people of the United States as a whole, are sovereign. And therefore, when the states tried to secede during the Civil War, Lincoln said they couldn't, pointing to Wilson, because we, the people of the Union as a whole, had to consent before the Union could be changed. So we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, that beautiful language about more perfect union, which I think picks up the whole idea of virtue, is that we're supposed to try to be more perfect as individuals, and in addition, to be more perfect as a union, as a government. By becoming more perfect in our self-government, our personal government, of our passions, we become more perfect in our self-government as a society. And then the other important parts of the preamble: establish justice, assure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, picking up on that language about securing liberty, which was inherent in the social contract theory. The whole point of we, the people of the United States, making this union is to secure the blessings of liberty. And if government breaks the contract, then we have a right to alter it through Article 5, which is the amendment process in the Constitution, or we still retain that right of revolution if we, the people, in a solemn, considered way, determine that government has broken its side of the bargain. So that connects the idea of we, the people, who have natural or unalienable rights from God or nature rather than government, make a government in order to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And the way that the government keeps its end of the bargain is through the rule of law, by ensuring that we cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That means we can be deprived of life, liberty, or property with due process, but through laws that are passed by democratically elected legislatures and enforced by independent courts that afford us basic rights of due process, like a right of a jury, or the right to be heard, or the right to be confronted with witnesses, or the other rights guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. But without due process of law, we cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property, because that is inherent in the bargain. Final thing I will share is rule of law is the hardest of the three concepts to define. And I asked Justice Neil Gorsuch, who is currently the honorary chair of the National Constitution Center, how he defined the rule of law. And Kerry just posted the video of Justice Gorsuch online, and I think we can, Kerry, let's share it in the chat because it's so cool.
Okay, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, and Justice Gorsuch said, think about the Roman Empire, where the Emperor Caligula would post the laws on tablets that were so high above the city walls that people couldn't read them. That's the antithesis of the rule of law, said Justice Gorsuch, when you don't know the law, so you can't obey it. It's not prospective and general. It's secret and hidden and known only to the rulers, not to the rules, not to the governed. That was a great definition, I thought. And it connects to this idea of prospectivity and generality. You can't pass a law in retrospect saying anyone named Jeff who really loves the founders is hereby outlawed and banished, and all of my heirs are attainted. That would be a bill of attainder, the antithesis of the rule of law. But if you can say, you pass a law saying everyone who gives boring con law classes that go over more than 5 minutes, gets fined, maybe that would be constitutional, although I hope you wouldn't do that either. But you see the point that laws have to not be directed against persons. They can't be infected by animus. They can't single up people out based on immutable characteristics, but they have to be general and known to all and apply to all. All right, Kerry, what do you think?
I think that is awesome. I love that this group was looking at the Three-Fifths Compromise, looking at Jefferson and trying to understand virtue and these ideas of natural rights, popular sovereignty, and rule of law. And what we talked about in the earlier class today was the same thing, that how do we understand these principles and how they apply to our government, into the Constitution, into the way we live today. The earlier class today was looking at it in pardons and saying, who's allowed to pardon, when are they pardoned? So trying to understand rule of law and the application in modern times. So what I love about this class is we look at these big ideas, these theories, and then we can apply them all year long, every 24/7, and be able to pull from them, where is our balance in our country, in the balance of the rule by the people, the power and the rights that you have as being an individual, and how the rule of law needs to be transparent and clear and applied equally to all, and protect everybody's rights as well. So it really just wraps up everything we're doing in this class and theory that we can apply and keep chatting in the chat about. So I love the energy around this. Back to you, Jeff.
Wonderful. Well, that's it, friends. If you feel like some fun work, then do check out that what the founders learned from the Greeks and Romans panel. It's on the Interactive Constitution, and we'll podcast it tomorrow. It's really exciting. And the book is called First Principles, which is really wonderful.
And there it is in the chat one more time for you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Kerry. See you soon, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.